Today, we are joined by someone who walked away from a high flying corporate career to follow his passion and built a life of financial freedom. PK Gupta. He worked with JP Morgan, Monitor Deloitte, and Virgin Australia before turning to property investing. There is a high chance you are already following him on social media and building a portfolio using his advice. He has 55,000 followers on YouTube, 19,000 on Insta, and 20,000 on LinkedIn. For over a decade, he has built his own portfolio and helped hundreds of families and individuals achieve passive income through his unique data led system of investing in the top 5% of properties in Australia. His mission is simple: to remove financial stress so people can spend more time doing the things they love with the people they love. We'll explore his journey, the myths of property investing, how young people can start preparing to buy property, and his vision for building financial freedom through smarter choices.
Welcome to the Oz Property Investment Mastery Podcast. My name's PK and I help busy people build passive income by buying top 5% growth and cash flow property and build a portfolio using data without wasting months doing research, spending weekends at inspection or catching flights, or dropping $10,000 to $20,000 on buyer's agents every single time. So if you're confused, lack confidence, and just overwhelmed with all the information and marketing misinformation available online and don't know where to start, then this show is for you.
PK, how are you today?
Thank you very much, Abhi. Yeah, I'm very grateful to be here, feeling very honored, and it's always nice to speak and try to give some humble advice, to the younger generation, because we were all young at one time and we know the stresses and confusion that you have to go through. So it's always nice to sort of give back in that way.
So PK, I want to start complimenting you with a name that people call out, saying that he's the most humble guy in real estate industry. So that's amazing that you have maintained your charm and your cool despite seeing so much of success in your sector. How about we start with your childhood? How was it like growing up, and how did you get to know that property and finance is something where you want to be?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to keep it pretty succinct because we can talk about it for hours. I think, I was born in India in a city called Lucknow, and we migrated to New Zealand to a place called Christchurch in the South Island when I was 4 years old. That was in 1994. And at that time, I think it was relatively easy to be a migrant insofar as the government in New Zealand would, try to give some financial incentives for migrants. Although, they were very modest, but at least it allowed you to have some cushion, when you first landed. But I remember my father, somehow or other, I still remember, even though I was very young, the conversation was in India at that time, you couldn't take out a lot of money as a migrant for various reasons. And so even though my family was, pretty okay living in an extended family sort of situation in India, when we came to New Zealand, I think we literally had, I was 4, my parents literally had like $500. So, it was like, there's people much worse off than that as well. But, relatively, it was a pretty modest position to start with. And I just always remember, we lived in a pretty nice area. Somehow or other, the government had organized that. And so therefore there was this huge disparity between what I had or what our family had, like in a 1 bedroom sort of small flat versus the other demographic in that. So I went to primary school and, I just remember, you're young as a kid, you kind of don't think about it too much, but slowly over the years, it starts dawning on you that all these other kids have all of this stuff and like I don't have this stuff. And even in small things, like I remember once there was a school excursion, I must have been 5, right? And they took us in New Zealand, there was a place called Countdown, which is a bit like Woolies, I guess, in Australia. And the teachers asked all the kids to bring $1, I think it was $1 or $2, that they could then spend as they want at the supermarket. And it was like a field trip, an excursion that from school, we all went there, all the kids with like a couple of teachers, and it was meant to be fun. And it was fun. And I saw my friends, somehow this memory or impression has remained in my mind they all bought like, a chocolate bar or this or that. But my mum said that, we're giving you this dollar, you have to buy a can of condensed milk because we need that for like the dinner or, for like the cooking in the evening or in the weekend or whatever. So she tried to make it fun because condensed milk is also sweet, but it also can help the family, in terms of the cooking ingredient. So, I mean, I didn't think too much of it, but clearly I did because it left an impression. So I just always remember, probably from the age, they say the boy's intelligence takes longer to develop than a girl's intelligence. Maybe from around age 9 or 10, I sort of started having this fierce desire in my mind and in my heart that I want to not be inferior, materially speaking, than the people around me. It's not that I envied them or that I was jealous and I wanted to bring them down, but I was thinking, why can't I also be like them? You know, just simple things like I think PlayStation 1 came out sometime around that time. And of course, it was like a no brainer. There's no point even me asking for it. And so I went without all these things just because in my mind it was like, there's no point even asking for them because that'll just make my parents feel bad for having to say no. So it felt like I had matured and become somewhat financially literate just by virtue of that situation. And also being an only child, I think, you tend to take a bit more responsibility as part of the family. And so that fierce desire started in, I would say around 8 or 9 years old. And then by the time intermediate school, we call it intermediate in New Zealand, I was like 11 or 12. I think around that time, Google had also started. And I remember Googling, how to make money or how to the highest paying jobs. Maybe this was around 12 or 13 years age. And this thing called investment banking came up. And so then I had no idea what investment banking was. I had like no idea of anything, but all I knew was when I graduate, I want to have a job that paid the most money. And so that I can live a life different to what I had experienced in the past. And then hopefully in the future, provide that life to my future family, wife and kids and stuff like that. So, I mean, back then, entrepreneurship, property, all this stuff wasn't even a thing. You can't be what you can't see. All I knew was people around me were successful accountants, lawyers, bankers, this and that. And so I thought that getting onto the corporate ladder and then climbing it was the best way to achieve financial happiness. So, yeah, that's a bit of a nutshell.
Oh, and you remember it. It must have been a really profound memory of you that you still carry it, and hence where you are. So that is a very interesting story. And look, that was one part of it. But at the same time, growing up, there are some role models that we have. So any role model, anything that is so profound enough that made an impact on you when you were growing up, and what lessons are guiding you still today?
Sure, sure. I don't have any external role models per se. I mean, this was before the age of content and before the age of, really even computers so much. And even on TV, I mean, I had sports role models. I used to play cricket. And so I remember, people like Nathan Astle, who was a New Zealand batter. He was a role model for me at that time, and a couple of Australian cricketers. But I mean, I was good at cricket, but I knew that wasn't gonna be my career progression. In terms of financial role models, I think it has to be said it was my mum and dad. Like, they didn't earn a whole lot of money, like I said before, but my wi my mother was a machinist. She, sewed curtains and blinds for probably around 20-25 years to help the family get by. And from her, I learned the lesson of being dutiful, but more than that, being disciplined. Motivation comes and goes, and sometimes we can watch an amazing movie, Pursuit of Happiness, and we're like, okay, I'm gonna work on Wall Street, or we can listen to an amazing song and then that hypes us up. But then the next day, the energy changes in our environment, both external and our internal environment, and we forget it. So I learned from her this concept of discipline, which means do the work regardless of what motivation you have, what obstacles there are, how busy you are, how tired you are. You just put your head down and do the work. I mean, for her, there was no question because if she didn't work, yeah, we wouldn't eat, right? And pay rent and all that kind of thing. So from her, I really learned discipline. And from my dad, I think I really learned the power of never giving up. When we first landed in New Zealand in Christchurch. My mum actually was the one that got the job first, and my dad, he was a mechanical engineer back in India, but for some reason they didn't recognize that degree in New Zealand, even though he was like, very well placed in India, working in like aircraft manufacturing and things like that as a designer, etc. But they didn't recognize that. So I remember he put in like 90 job applications all over New Zealand to get his first job. And that took 9 months, I think, or 9 or 10 months to get his first job. So from that, I mean, I didn't know it at the time, I was too little, but I learned what he had done afterwards. And so I learned that you just never give up. It's so easy to be demoralized, depressed, and down and out after giving 5 applications, 10 applications. And I think especially these days, in 2025, going into 2026, young people especially, a lot of them don't have the mental resilience that maybe we do. I'm speaking like an old man, because there's just so much distraction, so much noise, and so much content out there of people getting rich quick or getting something they want really easily. But there's something to be said about just digging your heels in and grit and resilience. And so I think that's what I learned from my father. And I think I have hopefully a combination of both those things.
And it's quite evident as well because of the way you talk and still remember those things and the values you carry. And it's true that having seen those difficult days, I mean, a lot of first generation migrants go through that, and there is always talk of local experience. And it's a story for a lot of people, but that is inspiring as well. Because at some point when you are successful, you never forget what happened in the past. That kind of motivates you to keep going. That's amazing. And it's the same in Australia as well. Getting a job is not easy unless you know someone who is at a position of influence and someone who knows you. It is still quite a journey. But the process is grueling, it's tough. So that makes you resilient as well and tough. So I think that was a great story you had. And look, you had a successful corporate career with JP Morgan, Deloitte. At what point did you realize that, hey, this is a good time for me to come full time and pursue my dream of property?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I started property investing back in 2011, even when I was in my graduate role of JP Morgan. I often tell the story, it's, as I said before, the investment banking is that job title that came up on that Google search, and my entire high school and university days were geared towards getting that job. And when I got it, I was like pretty elated, and when I then started working, put on a suit and tie for the first time, felt like I'd made it. Of course you haven't made it, you've just started, but you feel like you've made it. And then, it's in Sydney. So it's like, for me, it's the Big Apple because I went to university in Brisbane, and it was like living by myself for the first time. It was like really a big thing for me. But like the second week in, all of a sudden, it already dawned that I actually didn't enjoy it at all. Like I didn't enjoy, maybe it's just my personality, maybe a little bit arrogant, but I didn't enjoy being told what to do and being forced to live in a box, not just literally where you have a cubicle and you're working there. I was working 90 hours a week, but also metaphorically, the office politics, how you progress in your career, the relationships you have to make, the showboating. It's perception is everything to climb the corporate career. You may be amazing, but if you're sort of humble and quiet, you may not be recognized. So even from the second week, I was starting to clue on to these things because I'm very sort of sensitive in a way that I sort of pick up on things, the undertones of what's going on, the undercurrents of the environment. And so it didn't feel right to me. And of course, I labored through it and I stuck at it. But that's when I started investing in property on the side because I was thinking, okay, like I need an exit. I need a way out of this trap because I can't do this. I don't know how my mom did it, I don't know how my dad did it, but I want a better life. And of course, banking, 6-figure salary as a grad, fantastic. But for me, it was like, okay, I started to realize that just having money isn't enough. I want to have money. Of course, I was very materialistic, still am. But I want to have the time and energy to do what I want with it when I want. It's not just enough to have zeros in the bank account. Real wealth, I think, is having the freedom to do what you want when you want with whomever you want to do it with. And so that's why I started investing in property. But coming back to answer your question, when I actually went and quit that sort of 9 to 5, or for me it was 9 to 9, was when that property investment portfolio had matured and started to not replace my income, because 10 years into a corporate career, your income is, especially in, I guess, my field where very hard work, etc. It was, not insignificant, but I was developing 120K passive income. And so for me, it was like, okay, this is enough for me to be able to take a risk, quote unquote, and follow what I enjoy, which is property and many other things full time, as opposed to, just being an investor. Now I can actually make it a business and start helping others and blah, 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 blah. So I took a pay cut, but that 120K passive income from my portfolio was enough to say, okay, I'm okay with this lifestyle. And now I really want to do things, live life on my own terms.
I think that's interesting because most people don't have that goal. They are not clear on certain number that okay, at this point I want to come full time, because who knows, coming full time might generate 2x 3x, but that number is important, like you did. And that leads me to the other question, that do you think moving into property was the best decision of your life? If yes, why?
Uh, I think it was the best financial decision of my life. Of course, there are many other decisions that we make that are far more important and potent, when it comes to life happiness. But I really believe that financial happiness is not a precursor to overall happiness. Of course, it doesn't hurt, right? It definitely helps. But there's so many people out there in the world who have nothing but actually have everything, if you know what I mean. Like they're very, very blissful and content and satisfied, even though they're maybe materially impoverished. But I know for my personality, for my nature, financial happiness was a prerequisite to at least some sense of life happiness. And so, from that perspective, yeah, getting into property, probably buying that first property back in 2011 was the best decision I made. Because had I not done that, I'll be honest with you, I'd be like, had I not done that and had I not known about property, or if I had been too weak and too shy or too risk averse to invest in property, probably I'd still be in a 9 to 5 or 99. I'd probably be like, I was the head of strategy at Virgin when I quit. I'd probably be a director, or like, some sort of high level position. But I know the people that were above me when I was still working there, I got the sense that they were wearing golden handcuffs. Like, they were making $500,000 every year plus, they had the house, the cars, the fat, everything like that, the holidays. But I could tell that they didn't really love their jobs. Or if they did love their jobs, it was not it was like because their nature was very controlling, and being in a high position allowed them to control a big department, a lot of human beings, labor. But most of them didn't really, would they have worked if they didn't get paid? No, they wouldn't have. Whereas if I think about it now for myself, would I create YouTube videos like on property and finance and real estate, even if I didn't get paid? Probably I would, right? So I think that's the difference. It was the best decision of my financial life because it allowed me to do what I really wanted to do.
And I think two things. You talked about risk taking. You took that risk. You went by your gut feeling. The second is timing. I think they both are really important. And sometimes do you feel that it doesn't hurt to go back and dabble at the corporate for a few years again? If you could, would you do that?
For me, no. I'll be honest with you. If I lost everything today, I would not go back to corporate. Everyone's different. And then I don't mean to like judge anyone, but just from my own experience, I really disliked it. And for young people, don't take my advice on this. It's very important to have a corporate career. I mean, it can open up so many avenues, and everyone's got to pay the bills. It's not in everyone's nature to be an entrepreneur. It's not in everyone's nature to be a huge property investor either. You can't say that this person is successful, therefore I want to be like him or be like her. Rather, take the advice or take the guidance or take the lessons from those people and be yourself. Like apply it to your own life situation. And so I wouldn't go back to a 9 to 5. If I lost everything, I would just start a different business, maybe in a completely unrelated field, because that is my personality, that's my nature. But could I have done that? To your point, could I have done that in 2011? No way. I didn't have the financial wherewithal, the financial literacy. I didn't have the risk appetite. I didn't have the confidence, probably most important, confidence to start my own business back in 2011. Even though I'm speaking negatively about corporate, it's what has actually allowed me to be who I am today. And so I think there's a sense of gratitude towards that. But, things happen in seasons in life, sometimes even friends. Friends are sometimes seasonal. You can be really good friends for like 5, 6 years with someone, but then the next season comes and you have a different set of friends, you evolve. So I think financial progression is like that as well. Sometimes a career in corporate is the right thing for you. Sometimes business is the right thing for you. Sometimes other things are the right thing for you. And I think, yeah, one piece of advice to young people listening is to experiment so you know what actually vibes with you. Don't just be put into a pigeon box or to pigeonhole by what parents say or what culture says or what upbringing suggests or what content out there is telling you to do. You got to experiment. That's how you figure out what you actually enjoy.
Very important. And an experiment till the time you find your calling. And who knows, people might end up, being like you who are doing what they're enjoying. And that financial freedom lets you do a lot of creative things as well and spend a lot more time with family. So that's really great. And let's take the next step where talking about your journey, how it has evolved from your first property purchase to building the complete portfolio that generates a passive income. How has that journey been?
Yeah, sure. And once again, I'll try to answer with the lens of it helping your audience, which is, teenagers and the like. And so I'll try to avoid using any complex jargon or things like that. I mean, in property, one thing I'll say about property is that Australian real estate is probably the easiest investment class to invest in and get ahead for the everyday normal person. I'm not very intelligent. I don't I don't work at a hedge fund or anything like that. Anyone can do it. And that's what I figured out. Like I bought my first property, the thing rose in value after like, 6 months, a year. I think I'd bought it, can't remember, like early to mid 300s. And had gone up to almost 450 after a year. And I was like, okay, it's not life changing wealth, but like, that thing just went up and made me 100K for doing what? Like, I just bought a property. I did nothing. We can get into the data and like analyze how to predict the right suburbs, blah blah blah. But for me, that was the biggest aha moment. Like the thing rose in value without me doing anything. And so then I just bought another one. And young people might ask, well, how can you afford to get another one? Well, I mean, maybe not everyone can afford to get one after a year. I think it took me over a year to afford the next one. But between my girlfriend and myself, our incomes, we saved really hard. I remember my weekly grocery bill was $15. I know inflation has changed that in the last 10, 15 years, but yeah, I would eat at work as much as possible because I was working till late night anyway, so work would cover dinner, and I wouldn't treat myself to even like nice things. I would just try to save, 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 and so would she. She was a chartered accountant. And so then we got our next deposit, like 50, 60,000, by the way, which is the same amount that you need even right now to start your property investment journey. And then that was the deposit for the second property. And then the same thing, like call it luck or call it data. The thing went up in value. So now I'm like, I got two properties. I'm still renting, by the way. I got two properties and both of them have gone up like 100K. The first one up to 150 by now. So now we're scratching our head. We're like, why aren't more people doing this? Like, is everything going to collapse? Like, this seems to be too good to be true. But, like as we progressed in our career, ability to borrow money from the banks because the banks lend you money based on your income, that also increased. We were still renting this whole time. And then we just bought more and more and more properties. And of course, there's tactics, there's strategies. You buy in a trust or company, you buy certain yields, you buy certain locations, types of properties. I'm kind of simplifying it here. It's more to it than meets the eye right now. But essentially, when you boil it down, you're buying these, these assets that grow in value. And also they're self-sufficient. So they don't really cost anything to hold. Maybe for the first 1 or 2 years, they're costing something to hold, like maybe a few $1,000s, but then the rent increases and then they're self-sufficient. So you have this like assets that are rising, giving you cash, and it's like why would you stop doing that? So you just buy more and more. And then, like I said, there came a point where I was still working, but the properties were giving me 120K. And I think young people, especially in this day and age, whether it's property or other investment classes, change is the only constant. And gone are the days where you can do a 3, 4 year degree and expect to stay in that profession or career or job for a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, especially with AI completely disrupting everything. So I think, for people who are like me, who are risk averse and constantly, at least back then, I was like constantly stressed about my financial future. It's a really good idea to diversify your income, which is to say, have multiple streams of income. So your job may be one source of income. Maybe property is another source of income. Maybe ETFs are another source of income. A side hustle is another source of income, because I guarantee you, if you only have one source of income, there'll be a time when that source of income stops. And if you don't have any other avenues, then, you'll be in a little bit of a predicament, even, especially going forward. So that was my journey, Abhi. I didn't really know all these things that I'm talking right now. So there's an element of good luck involved. But yeah, I'm fortunate to have gone down that path.
No, it is very important because what you have mentioned is that we get so stuck up in our grind, day-to-day grind. Like you were working 9 to 9, but still you tried and started building the portfolio, and you are a classic, example of someone who has been there, done that over a period of time at a young age. So I think the other obvious question that audience would now have is, okay, at the point when you left the job, how many properties did you have, and what is your portfolio today?
Yeah, sure. So I think in 2019, when I stopped working, I was on, I think it was 9 or 10 properties, and the portfolio value was, I can't exactly remember, maybe like between $5 and $10 million or something like that. The LVR was, LVR means how much debt you have on the total portfolio. So the total debt was about 20 or 30%, maybe up to 35%, give or take. So that's what allowed that 120K passive income. Now, of course, now I have multiple businesses, different sources of income, and I've also done a lot of property developments that has allowed me to pay off debt. So now we're on about $25 million Australian dollars of property, including principal places of residence, and the passive income is about 300K. But I think it's very important, to note that that hockey stick going up from 120K passive to 300K passive, is because of business income. Obviously, I have property business, I have private equity business, I have a developing business, I have an investment business, which is in, startups. So I have different sources, and that allows you to sort of really accelerate. So I don't want anyone to, it should be an apples to apples comparison. It can't just say that this person has got this, so I can achieve that in the same period of time. They've got a lot of things going on, which has helped. But I think, I'm just once again trying to add as much value. I think the lesson that I've learned is that if you start, initially your gains will be maybe modest, but as those gains compound on one another and as your confidence increases, then what you can do in your financial life exponentially rises. So at the start, I never thought I would be in a position like this. I mean, I was too scared to like even do a simple paint job at home, let alone like build townhouses or gas stations. I was too scared to do any of this stuff. When you dip your toe in the water, then you start to realize that, yeah, it is a bit cold, but I think I can handle it. And then you go down to your knees and you're like, okay, it's getting a bit cold, but then you stay in there for like a minute. It's like, okay, now I've adjusted down to your waist. And then when you're up to about your navel, you're like, you know what? I'm good. I'm just going to dive in. And I think that's the biggest lesson I learned, that if you want to be in a super successful position, you have to start, but you don't have to dive in at the start. Don't compare your starting position with my ending position. Start where you can and go slowly as your risk appetite allows.
A beautiful example of comparing it with being in water. Nice. Um, Thanks for sharing that information. I keep on seeing there's so many thank you messages that you keep on sharing, and people are really happy engaging you. You have helped hundreds of families, individuals. Would you like to share some stories that deeply moved you and improved the power of property investing for people?
Sure. I actually interviewed a lady who's a client about 3 months ago. Her name's Wendy. She's from the Philippines, actually. She's a nurse, a registered nurse. She has this amazing story. I probably won't do it justice, but she was from the Philippines. She grew up in the Philippines, and she wanted to come to Australia. Like for her, Australia was this beacon of light out of the most likely negative environment that she was born into or she lived in. And to get to Australia, she needed to save enough money and also get a qualification. So what she did was she managed, which there was some reciprocal arrangement between the countries. She managed to go to Iraq and work as a nurse in a war-torn country with all the things that we know that happened there, like 10, 20 years ago. And there she worked as a nurse and dealt with all sorts of trials and tribulations. I mean, she shares some pretty um, yeah, moving stories about the locals, but that allowed her to gain enough money to be then come to Australia and afford the flight, the process of immigration, the visa costs, etc., etc. She really, I think she was saying when she went to Iraq, she was living in like a room with 6 other people or 8 other people, tiny little room, not much to eat. Like the conditions were pretty barren, all sorts of things like that. She moved to Australia and, she wanted to start a family, but it was really difficult for her and her partner to conceive. And therefore, they needed to use IVF. And of course, IVF is very, very expensive. And, finally they conceived. And then she found that she had cancer. And, it's just like one thing after another. And so this was her position, and she was kind of in the doldrums thinking, like, I've lived a life of such hardship. Is it going to be like this forever? Is my life only going to be one financial setback, one health setback, one family setback, one after another? Where is the light at the end of the tunnel that she thought Australia was when she was in the Philippines originally? And then she stumbled upon property investing. I don't know how she did it, maybe from my YouTube channel or some other place. And, she's a nurse, so she's not on like, 150K income. She's like average income or maybe even less than average, including her, partner as well, family to support. She, much like my mother, just had this attitude of discipline over motivation. So she sacrificed a lot for the family to be able to save for a deposit, and she bought that first house. And that house performed really well and it paid for itself. And she bought a next house. And oftentimes, there were detractors on her journey. She wasn't always supported by everyone around her, but yet she kept the blinkers on. She kept focusing like a laser forward. And she bought another one and she bought another one. And then when I interviewed her, I can't remember how many houses she had, maybe like 5 houses or something. But now, she's able to support her family using the properties. She's able to reduce her work hours as a nurse. I mean, she's not completely retired just yet because, she's just like 4 or 5 years into the journey. Able to reduce her work hours, spend more time with the family, go on like holidays, which was like an unheard of thing for her. And, she's finally like in a place where she feels calm, settled, financially secure. But I think the most important thing is that there's hope. I think human beings can withstand adversity as long as there's hope. There's a remarkable ability for the human mentality to go through like absolute horrors as long as you know that there's light at the end of the tunnel, that it's not going to be this way forever. So it's not like she's, on a beach, basking in $1 million passive income or anything like that. But the thing is that, there's progress. There's progress. And that progress proves to her and gives her the conviction that if she carries down this path, she carries on, walking this path, that her life will be better in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. And she'll achieve the Australian dream, which, she wanted to do, and which was the reason she left the Philippines in the first place. So, people like that, it's not like they're highly educated. It's not like they have hundreds of thousands of dollars to begin with. It's not like they have a very comfortable family environment off which they can launch their financial success. It's people like this who tell themselves that, you know what, my future is going to be different to my past and I'm going to take care of my family. And it's people like this that kind of give me a whole lot of life satisfaction and is really the reason I do what I do.
Very profound story, because usually an average person doesn't see such extremes of situation in life. And so what I'm seeing is that on one hand, we have someone like you started early on, and then we have someone who went through all sort of hurdles and roadblocks and still decided at whatever age she's decided, there's no bar, but then you need to take that first step towards the financial freedom. I want to ask some of the myths that young people should stop believing when it comes to property investment.
Okay, the myths that young people should stop believing. The first one, and probably the main one and the only one, is it's too hard to buy property. I think, the media does a great job of scaring young people into thinking that it's all the fault of previous generations, and it's all the fault of property investors, and it's all the fault of the tax system, and it's all that person's fault and this person's fault. But like, I remember when I was probably 12, I used to listen to a podcast. I was very early in the podcast scene. Wasn't it really a thing back then, podcast? But there was a podcast run by The Economist. I used to listen to it on iTunes. And The Economist, there used to be this journalist out of the UK that used to go to different parts of the world and interview very normal people. And one time they went to, I think, the Republic of Congo, I think it's called, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and they interviewed this teenager. Congo at that time had gone through like a genocide, literally millions of people had died, and it's just audio only podcast. And the person in The Economist asked this teenager, this African, what have you learned from life? All your family's gone, your home is gone. There's rebels at your metaphorical door every day. You don't have a career, etc., etc. They're just trying to get like kernels of insights from this person, their real life experience. And that boy answered, life is unfair. He did it in an African sort of accent, which made it like really deep and meaningful for me because it's very authentic and genuine. That he was saying like, life is unfair. Don't ever expect anyone to make life fair for you, and don't expect life to become fair. Life by nature is unfair. And as soon as I learnt this, then I came to deal with it. Then I came to, to cope with it. This was his response. And I remember lying down on my bed, I think it was the evening, and I listened to this and it kind of just went straight through my ears, through my brain down into my heart, and it lodged itself there, this piece of advice. And so I still remember it because, no one is out there to save you. And this is the thing that I kept telling myself. And so for young people, my advice would be the same. Like, no one is out there to save you. No one is out there to make your life better. Of course, we have parents and family. They're all like loving and hopefully and there to help us. But at the end of the day, no one can actually help you. They can try, but you have to help yourself. No one cares about you as much as you do, and no one can do anything about it as much as you can for yourself. And so when it comes to property investing or financial literacy or financial success in general, you have to take the wheel. You have to be the master of your own destiny. And when it comes to housing or affordability or buying your first house or property or investment, you got to make it work. The government isn't going to make things easier. The rich people aren't going to make things easier. Your friends aren't going to make it easier. You have to think, what can I do to get onto the property ladder? And I guarantee you, because I have clients and non-clients every single day, all the way from age 18 to 25, who are making this happen. Like one person earns like 60K a year. He's didn't go to university, he's in a trade, and he just saved. He saved and saved and saved. On the side, he drove Uber, and after 3 years, he had enough deposit, 60K, to buy an investment property. He lives in Sydney. He knows he can't afford to buy in Sydney, right? But he bought an investment property in regional New South Wales. And just like so many that have gone before him, he knows that if this goes up in value, he can then use that equity to buy another one. And then maybe in 5-6 years' time, he can either sell those properties or use equity to buy a home to live in Sydney. And so it's about strategy. You can juxtapose that with some other person who thinks, what, it's all too hard. My salary is never going to be high enough for me to buy my dream home in Sydney. So let me just wallow in my self-pity. You've got two options in life. One is to do something about it, and the other option is to feel sorry for yourself. And from what I understood from this bloke in Congo, who had it much more tough than any of us, is that, no one is out there, no one is going to come and save you. And so you might as well choose that first path.
Beautiful. What an example, right? I mean, when you listen to such a story, you are really thankful to what you have. And this leaves a deep impression on you that some action has to be taken to make life fair. Coming on that, do you think it is still possible for an average young Australian to buy property and build wealth? Or if that dream has become really hard today?
I think it's as possible as it ever was. And the simplest way that I can explain this is that when I started, I bought a property with $60,000 deposit. And you can do the same right now, $60,000 deposit. And so I don't see how it's any different. Of course, buying your own home, especially if you're in a place like Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, is much more expensive. Like, there's no doubt about it. Affordability has eroded, but affordability erosion doesn't mean that there isn't affordable houses in Australia, right? They may not be where you live, but they may be somewhere else. So you have to find that other place, use that investment or those investments to catapult you into a financial position where then you can buy your own home in the place that you want to live. And so I think people have to think laterally. The Australian dream of buying your own home is still possible, but only for those people who think laterally and are resourceful. You don't need a huge amount of resources. You just need to be resourceful, which means thinking with dexterity. Don't follow the average person. The average person isn't affording houses in Australia anymore. So you have to be different from the average, which means you have to think differently. You have to be different. And that is a complete lifestyle change often. I'm seeing my clients, and of course, not just clients, many other community members do this every single day. And so that gives me confidence that even though it is much harder than it was before, it's still possible, and it will remain possible for those who are financially literate and have a fierce desire, like I did back in the day, to get ahead.
I think that's a great input. How do you perceive the Australian market in short term and long term?
I think from a social fabric perspective, it's a real shame how expensive housing has become. Even as property investors, of course, we want houses to go up, but the rate at which they're increasing is, first thing I'll say, is rapid. And that means that there becomes a sense of inequality. There becomes a sense of people who have and have not. And that inequality, the chasm between the two parties, it exacerbates exponentially when you have house prices rising so quickly. And so in my perspective, the reality is, without getting into like finer economic details, which I can if you want, but the fundamental principle is that we don't have enough houses in Australia and we have too much demand. Too much demand being from two sources. One source is those who are in the top 20% in Australia. Oftentimes people say housing can't increase in value anymore or at the same rate as it did in the last 5 or 10 years because the average person, the median person, can't afford it. And that's true. The median person can't afford a house in Australia, at least not in Sydney or Melbourne. But unfortunately, we live in a capitalistic society where house prices, as well as other goods and services, aren't dictated by what the middle person or the median person can afford, but rather they're dictated by what enough people can afford. And if there's enough people in the top 20% in terms of wealth, top 20, 30% of Australia, then those people are buying anyway, even though the middle person can't afford. And so that is an unfortunate reality, and that's one source of ongoing price increases. And the second source of ongoing price increases is a current immigration policy that the Australian government have. Of course, I'm an immigrant. I immigrated from New Zealand to Australia. Abhi, you're probably an immigrant. There is, in fact, according to the ABS in the last census, I think 50 or 51% of people living in Australia right now are either first generation or second generation immigrants. So this country is, a country of immigrants, and immigrants provide a lot of value and benefit to the nation. Of that, there's no doubt. I mean, just see in the last 50, 60 years, Australia's built on the immigration story. However, with such a chronic shortage of houses in Australia, having the same amount of immigration as we currently have, 3, 4, 5, 600,000 people every single year, simply means that demand continues to rise and supply just doesn't keep up. And therefore, that is the second fundamental source of price increase nationally for the Australian property market. I think these two sources are undeniable and they're statistically reasoned and backed. And for that reason, whether you're on this camp or the other camp, fortunate or unfortunate, house prices are going to continue rising.
And that really makes sense and doesn't look like anything is going to stop immigration to Australia, which means the pressure is on. What would be your advice to someone in their 20s who want to prepare for their first property purchase?
Okay, so I think the first piece of advice, or the main advice actually, I would say for someone in their 20s getting ready for their first property purchase is not to accept what anyone else is telling you when it comes to where to buy, what to buy, and how to buy. Because what we have in Australia is a very unproductive economy. This is a proven fact. Our productivity levels are the lowest amongst developed nations, our peers. And one reason for that is the property market. Everyone invests in the property market. And it's like I said at the start, it's a very easy way to get quote unquote rich, over the medium to long term. But what that also means is that there are 1,001, I'm being very, I'm lowballing, there's 1,001 property companies, experts, gurus telling you what to do, why to do it, where to buy, how to buy, etc. And every single day I see people make mistakes when it comes to either investing or buying their own home. And I think education, unbiased, impartial, independent education is what is needed for whether you're buying your first home or investing. It goes without saying when it comes to investing, of course, you don't want to just click a Facebook ad and, pay someone tens of thousands of dollars to then tell you what to do or give you a property. Like, I think young people need to understand that people who work for them work in their own interests, not necessarily in your interests. No one cares about your money as much as you do. But even to buy your first home, of course, it's an emotional decision as well. But I think there's two concentric circles. One is your emotional decision. Where do you want to live? What kind of property do you like to live in? What can you afford? But then the second concentric circle is note, you'll not live in this property forever. In that Australia, on average, tenure is 5 to 7 years of people living in a property. You'll at some point sell it, upgrade, downgrade. And so why not come at even your principal place of residence with an investment mindset? And so learn investment principles so that as and when in the future you upgrade, downgrade, move out, keep it as an investment property, that it can catapult you towards an investment portfolio. It's always good to own property. They're not making more land. It's one of the most rarest things on earth. Of course, Australia is huge, but developable land is very small, much less that can be actually developed per council approvals. So get as much land as you can, but educate yourself on how to do so and educate yourself and make your own decisions. Don't just blindly absorb or accept what other people are telling you, including me.
That's very good input that you have given. Is there any book or any person you recommend people also start reading the book or start following to build that knowledge? I know you have a big fan following, people listen to you, but then is there someone you recommend, someone who you also follow?
I think for people who are very early on in their financial literacy journey, there's a book called Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. I think I got that right. Yeah. It sounds very materialistic, Think and Grow Rich, and also sounds very like Tony Robbins-esque, motivational, that you just think and you manifest it and you become rich. Actually, that's not what the book is really about, at least not in the way that I interpreted it. The book teaches you how to think because the thought processes of wealthy, successful people are completely different to the thought processes of those who have a poverty mindset. I'm originally from the Indian culture, Indian tradition. And in India, the cultural upbringing is work hard at school, at university, get as high grade as possible, and then become an engineer, a lawyer, or a doctor, or IT professional. And then, you get a good job. When you have a sufficiently good job, then you get married. And then you buy your own home and you spend the rest of your life trying to pay that home off. And you be a good father, you be a good grandfather, and good job. That's a good life well lived, right? And look, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nobility in that, definitely. But that is not the mindset of those who are financially wealthy. I'm not saying that people who are in that evolution that I've just described are not wealthy. They are wealthy in many other ways, and maybe they're very self-satisfied and content with their financial position. But if you want to be truly wealthy, you have to completely rewire your brain and how to think. And unfortunately, we come into this world, and two people who claim to be our mother and father, they slap a name on us like a label. They slap maybe a religion on us. They slap a way of thinking on us, and they mold us in the way that they've been molded, maybe involuntarily. And then we become like that. And if they weren't so well off, then that will be our mold. But if you want to break that mold, you have to completely rewire what's in your head. And so this book was a game changer for me. And it really allowed me to understand that when people say you can be anyone you want to be and you can have as much wealth as you want, those aren't just woo woo motivational, talks that someone gives on stage and gets paid for. Like, it's actually a reality. And to accept it's a reality needs a complete rewire of your mindset.
It does, and it's not easy. For example, if you come from a businessman family, you know how to ask for money, how to charge, how to talk about money comfortably. But coming from family like yours, I am from the family of academics. I mean, it's really difficult to start talking about money and leave aside the fact that you want to charge money. This is a really a profound change, and it's not easy to be done. It's a significant mind shift change. Have you ever made a mistake in property investing? And if yes, what did it teach you?
Yeah, I always give this example. In 2016, I think, I bought a property in Cairns, and the mistake that I made was I went by news articles. Even though I had a data system at that time that was proven and that was working for my preceding properties, there was a news article that said that there's a Hong Kong billionaire that is going to start this huge casino, billions of dollars of investment in Cairns. Tourism will increase, blah, 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 the rest is history. Never ended up happening. I think that billionaire went to either jail or he went bankrupt or he didn't end up investing. And, it was a bit of a dud investment for the next 5 or 6 years. Of course, now it's done okay because Cairns is actually pretty strong and, property is a very forgiving asset class long term. But the principle that I learned from that was two things. One is don't invest based on the news cycle. There's always a news cycle, interest rates going up, down, recession happening, not happening, wars happening overseas, not happening, unemployment going up, or going down. There's always something going on the news cycle. Ignore the news cycle. That's a lesson I learned. And the second lesson I learned was opportunity cost. I bought that property for about 400K-ish back then. And after 5 years, it was probably still around 400K-ish. And in that same time, that 400K could have been used to double, triple, quadruple my money in other places. So it's not just a case of what you invest in, but also the lesson I learned was the opportunity cost, and maybe taking it a bit further for those people who are maybe teenagers and maybe 18 or early 20s, and they're not investing or they're not doing something about their financial future. Every hour, every day, every month you are inactive, there's a huge opportunity cost. Your line of financial abundance could have looked like this, but because of being inactive, it's like this, or maybe in the middle. So understand that and make sound decisions. Yeah, those are the two things.
Definitely makes sense. There's another question that keeps coming up. Which one to prioritize, regional versus metro cities? Any thoughts about that?
My honest thoughts about that is that regional versus capital cities are just terminologies made up by someone, sometime, somewhere. But when it comes to data, looking at the last 50 years of data in Australia, regional, quote unquote, performs just as well as capital cities, quote unquote. And so this term is a bit useless in my perspective. For example, Launceston in Tasmania has performed better. It's a regional town. It's actually grown more than Sydney in the last 30 years. And, you could say Sydney, big city, all the immigrants come, a lot of jobs, big financial center. All that's true, but the data is the data, right? And that's not just for Launceston, for so many areas. So, of course, you want to be careful of investing in a very small town where, if something happens to that town's main job industry, the town could implode. got to be careful of things like that. Invest in diversified economies, but regional versus capital cities is a moot subject in my mind.
I think that's really important to understand. I think that's where people spend a lot of time debating what to do. So thanks for that. I can continue talking to you. I'm really enjoying the time flies with you and such a beautiful dialogue we are having. However, like all the other good things, this also has to come to an end. So finally, what is the message to our audience? The audience is large, the teenagers and the young adults, about building wealth, reducing financial stress, and creating a life of freedom.
I think that there was a statistic I heard and I could resonate with it, and it goes that 85% of life's most defining moments happen before the age of 35. In other words, of course there's exceptions to this, but for most people, who you will become will be dictated by what you achieve by age 35. Not just financially, but in other places as well. Obviously, the most, apparent example is if that you flunk school, you don't go to like university or TAFE, or, you just like don't take care of your education, then obviously that will have an impact. So that's just one example. But whether it comes to life partners, or whether it comes to financial investments, or when it comes to business, etc., 85% of your most life defining moments will happen by the age of 35. So for those of your audience that are teenagers or in their early 20s, make the most of this next 5, 10, 15 years. If you work hard now, you think different from 99% of the population, then your life will be different from the 99% of the population. If you want to be normal and average, that's completely fine. There's nothing wrong with it. There's no judgment from my perspective or anyone else. It's not that rich people are better than not rich people. But if you have an intent and an ambition and a desire to be financially really, really abundant, then try to get as far ahead as possible by the age of 35. And that's not to detract anyone who might be parents that might be listening that are like over the age of 35. Sooner rather than better. Best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but if you didn't, like, do it today. There's always an opportunity for it to grow in the future. But that's probably my advice.
Thanks a lot. That was really helpful. So, look, thanks for sharing your journey from corporate boardroom to financial freedom through property, and for showing us that wealth building is not about luck, but about discipline, data, and mindset. To our listeners, whether you are a teenager dreaming of your first property, a young professional balancing work and savings, or a parent thinking about your family's future, remember, financial freedom is built step by step, and the earlier you start, the better.